Looking back now, sitting in this coffee shop where Eric and I had our first real date 7 years ago, I realize I created my own prison. The barista just handed me my usual vanilla latte, and for a split second I thought about asking her to add extra foam the way Eric always did when he made my morning coffee. But Eric isn't here anymore, and honestly, that's probably my fault. My name is Juliana. I'm 32, and I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me because I thought love was about winning. It started innocently enough. We met at the advertising agency where I worked as an account manager. Eric was this gentle soul from the creative department, the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday and brought homemade cookies to office meetings. He had these warm brown eyes that crinkled when he laughed, and he laughed often back then. Really laughed, not the careful, measured responses I grew accustomed to later. I fell hard and fast. Eric was everything the men I dated before weren't. He listened when I talked, actually remembered conversations we'd had weeks earlier, and never made me feel like I was competing for his attention. When he told me he loved me after 4 months of dating, sitting on his tiny balcony watching the sunset, I genuinely believed I'd found my person. But somewhere between falling in love and getting married, I stopped seeing Eric as a partner and started seeing him as a project. It began with small suggestions. His coworker Brandon seemed flirty. Didn't Eric notice how Brandon always found excuses to stop by his desk? His sister called too much couldn't she respect that he had a wife now. These observations felt protective, loving even. I was just watching out for my husband's best interests. Eric would consider my concerns seriously, weighing them with that thoughtful expression I'd initially found endearing. Sometimes he'd adjust his behavior to accommodate my feelings. When he stopped grabbing drinks with Brandon after work, I felt a dangerous sense of satisfaction. I'd spoken and he'd listened. I mattered. The problem was, I started to like mattering too much. By our 2nd year of marriage, I'd perfected what I now recognize as emotional manipulation, though I convinced myself it was just effective communication. I discovered that Eric would do almost anything to avoid conflict, especially if I cried. I learned that questioning his loyalty to our marriage was a sure way to get him to distance himself from friends I didn't particularly like. I found that making him feel guilty about spending money on himself meant more budget for things I wanted. The worst part, it worked beautifully. Eric gradually became isolated from his support system, financially dependent on my approval, and emotionally exhausted from walking on eggshells around my moods. I told myself I was creating intimacy, building a tight partnership where we only needed each other. Really, I was suffocating him. The intimacy ultimatum came during what I now realize was the beginning of the end. We'd been arguing about money again. Eric wanted to contribute to his younger brother's college fund, and I felt it was financially irresponsible. The argument escalated when Eric mentioned he'd already spoken to his brother about it, making plans without consulting me first. I felt my control slipping and I panicked. "You seem to forget that I'm your wife," I said, voice rising. "I'm supposed to come first in every decision you make. If you can't accept that, then you obviously don't respect this marriage." Eric sat quietly on our couch, hands folded in his lap. He developed this stillness over the years, a careful way of holding himself that I mistook for submission. "I hear what you're saying," he replied carefully. "Do you? Because your actions suggest otherwise." I moved closer, deploying the tactics that had always worked before. "Eric, I need to know you're committed to us. To this." I gestured around our living room at the life we'd built together. "If you can't prioritize our marriage over everyone else's needs, then maybe we need to reconsider some things." I let the implication hang between us. No discussion about his brother's college fund meant no physical intimacy. I'd never stated it quite so bluntly before, but the threat had always been there, humming beneath the surface of our disagreements. Eric looked at me for a long moment and something shifted in his expression, something I should have paid attention to. "Okay," he said simply. "I understand." I felt victorious. I'd won again. Except I hadn't won anything. I'd just shown Eric exactly who I was, and for the first time in our relationship, he was really listening. The changes started so gradually I almost missed them. Eric became agreeable about everything. He stopped arguing about my spending, stopped questioning my decisions, stopped engaging in any conflict at all. When I suggested we skip his family's annual barbecue, he simply nodded. When I decided we needed new furniture and charged thousands to our credit card, he didn't even mention it. At first, I was thrilled. I'd finally achieved the perfect marriage where my husband understood his role. I bragged to my sister about how well-trained Eric had become, how he'd learned to respect my position as his wife. But something felt wrong. Eric had become too quiet, too compliant. Our conversations grew shorter, more superficial. He'd smile when I talked, nod in the right places, but his eyes seemed distant, like he was somewhere else entirely. When I reached for him at night, he didn't pull away, but his touch felt perfunctory, obligatory. I told myself he was just going through a phase. Men sometimes got moody, everyone knew that. He'd snap out of it once he remembered how good he had it with me. Instead, he got quieter. Eric started working longer hours, accepting projects that kept him at the office until well past dinner. He'd come home exhausted, eat quietly, and retreat to his computer or a book. When I tried to initiate conversations about our relationship, about what was wrong, he'd give me those same measured responses. "Everything's fine, Juliana, I'm just tired." "Nothing's wrong, work's been busy." "I love you, I'm just processing some things." The processing comment worried me most. Eric was always processing, always thinking through problems methodically, but what was there to process? I'd given him clear expectations for our marriage, and he'd accepted them. What more did he need to think about? I decided to remind him what he stood to lose. One evening in March, after he'd spent another night absorbed in some book instead of paying attention to me, I laid down the law again. "Eric, I need us to talk about your priorities," I said, settling beside him on the couch. "I feel like you're choosing work and your hobbies over spending time with your wife." He marked his place in the book and turned to face me, that patient expression I'd grown to hate. "I've been here every night this week," he said quietly. "Physically, yes, but emotionally." "You're completely checked out." I moved closer, placing my hand on his arm. "When was the last time you really talked to me? When was the last time you seemed excited to see me? I'm excited to see you every day." His tone was so neutral it made me want to scream. This wasn't the passionate man who used to light up when I walked into a room. This was someone going through the motions of being a husband. "This isn't working," I said, pulling out my nuclear option. "Either you start acting like you want to be married to me, or we stop acting like we're married at all." I expected tears, panic, promises to try harder. Instead, Eric closed his book and set it carefully on the side table. "What would acting like I want to be married to you look like?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. "You should know what a good husband does." "I'd like to hear your specific expectations." Something about his tone made me suspicious, but I pushed forward. "You prioritize time with me over everything else. You check with me before making decisions that affect both of us. You show interest in my day, my thoughts, my feelings." I was gaining momentum now, feeling like I was getting somewhere. "And you stop treating intimacy like a chore." Eric nodded slowly. "And if I don't meet these expectations? Then we don't have a real marriage, do we?" He was quiet for such a long time I started to fidget. Finally, he looked directly at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You're right," he said. "We don't have a real marriage." That night, Eric slept in the guest room for the first time in our 7 years together. When I woke up the next morning, he was already gone for work, leaving only a polite note about working late again. I spent the day calling my friends, seeking validation for my position. Surely they'd agree that Eric was being unreasonable, that I deserved better from my own husband. But the conversations felt different. My friend Casey, who'd always supported my approach to managing my relationship, seemed hesitant. "Maybe he just needs some space to process," she suggested. "Process what?" I told him exactly what I needed from him. "Well, sometimes when people feel cornered, they shut down instead of fighting back." Cornered? I wasn't cornering anyone. I was communicating my needs clearly. Wasn't that what all the relationship experts recommended? Eric came home that night with groceries and flowers, the same yellow tulips he'd brought me when we were dating. He cooked my favorite pasta dish and opened a bottle of wine. For a moment, I thought my ultimatum had worked. He was trying again. but dinner felt like a performance. Eric asked about my day, complimented the new dress I was wearing, and made pleasant conversation about weekend plans. Everything I'd said I wanted from him. Yet somehow it felt hollow, like watching an actor play the role of a loving husband. After dinner, he loaded the dishwasher while I changed into something more comfortable. When I emerged from the bedroom in the lingerie he'd once told me he loved, Eric was sitting on the couch reading again. "I thought maybe we could spend some time together," I said, settling beside him. He set down his book immediately and turned toward me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course." What happened next was technically intimacy, but it felt like the emotional equivalent of a business transaction. Eric was attentive, considerate, generous even. He did everything right. But it felt like making love to a stranger who happened to know exactly what I liked. Afterward, as we lay in the dark, I finally asked the question that had been gnawing at me. "Are you having an affair?" Eric was quiet for so long I thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, softly, "No, Juliana, I'm not having an affair." "Then what's wrong with us?" Another long silence. "I think we want different things from marriage." "What does that mean?" "You want a husband who does what you tell him to do. I want a wife who sees me as an equal partner." His words hung in the darkness between us. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but something about the way he said it made me feel exposed, like he'd seen through every manipulation I'd thought was subtle. "I've never asked you to be anything other than a good husband. You've asked me to stop talking to my family. You've asked me to end friendships. You've asked me to check with you before spending my own money on my own needs. You've threatened to withhold affection if I don't comply with your demands." His voice remained calm, matter of fact. "That's not partnership. That's control." I felt panic rising in my chest. This conversation was veering into territory I couldn't navigate with tears or anger or sexual manipulation. Eric was stating facts, not expressing emotions I could redirect. "I was protecting us," I said weakly. "From what?" "From people who don't understand our relationship. From influences that could hurt what we've built together. Or from people who might help me realize what a healthy relationship actually looks like." The accusation hit like a physical blow. I sat up in bed, pulling the sheet around myself. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Eric turned on the bedside lamp, and I could see his face clearly for the first time in weeks. He looked tired, older somehow. "When was the last time you asked about my feelings without trying to change them? When was the last time you supported a decision I made that you didn't personally benefit from?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Every example I could think of had strings attached, conditions I'd placed on my support. "I've been thinking about this a lot lately," Eric continued. "About what happened to us. About when I stopped feeling like your husband and started feeling like your employee." "You're being dramatic." "Am I? You literally told me that I'd get no intimacy unless I followed your orders. In what world is that not treating me like an employee?" I wanted to explain that it hadn't been an order, that I'd just been trying to communicate my needs. But hearing it reflected back to me made me realize how it must have sounded to him. "So what are you saying?" I asked, though I was terrified of the answer. "I'm saying I don't want to be married to someone who sees me as a subordinate, and I don't think you want to be married to someone who expects to be treated as an equal." The divorce papers appeared 3 weeks later. I fought it initially, convinced I could reason with him, seduce him back, make him remember what we'd had together. But Eric had developed an immunity to my usual tactics. When I cried, he offered tissues and suggested counseling. When I raged, he remained calm and asked if I needed some time to cool down. When I tried to initiate physical contact, he gently redirected with suggestions for meaningful conversation instead. It was infuriating and heartbreaking in equal measure. I'd spent years training him to respond to my emotional cues, and now he was treating me like a stranger having a breakdown in public. Polite, concerned, but fundamentally unmoved. The worst part was watching him reconnect with everyone I'd convinced him to distance himself from. His family welcomed him back with open arms, never once saying, "I told you so," though I'm sure they were thinking it. His friends rallied around him, organizing guy trips and game nights and all the activities I'd gradually discouraged during our marriage. Meanwhile, I was discovering how small my own world had become. I'd been so focused on controlling Eric's social circle that I'd neglected my own relationships. When I called friends for support during the divorce, I realized how many of our conversations over the years had centered on my complaints about Eric, my strategies for managing our relationship, my frustrated venting about his resistance to my guidance. Casey was honest with me in a way that stung. "Jules, I love you, but you've been impossible to be around lately. Every conversation becomes about what Eric's doing wrong or how you're trying to fix him." "It's exhausting." My sister was blunter. "I never understood why he married you in the first place. You treated him like a pet project." Even my mother, who'd always supported my side in any conflict, seemed hesitant to offer the unconditional sympathy I expected. "Maybe this is an opportunity to think about what you really want from a relationship," she suggested gently. "And what you're willing to give." I didn't want to think about what I was willing to give. I wanted to focus on what I deserved to receive. The final papers were signed on a rainy Tuesday in September. Eric was generous in the settlement, more generous than he needed to be. He let me keep most of the furniture, took responsibility for debts I'd accumulated, and didn't ask for alimony despite earning significantly less than I did. His lawyer seemed surprised by his requests. "Are you sure about this?" she asked during our final meeting. "You're entitled to much more." Eric just shook his head. "I want her to be okay. I want both of us to be okay." Even in divorce, he was kinder to me than I'd been to him in marriage. I moved into a downtown apartment and threw myself into work, determined to prove that I was thriving without him. I dated aggressively, went out most nights, and posted carefully curated photos on social media showing my fabulous new single life. But late at night, alone in my beautiful empty apartment, I found myself thinking about small moments with Eric. The way he'd bring me tea when I was stressed about work deadlines. How he'd listen to me complain about difficult clients without trying to fix anything, just offering presence and sympathy. The Sunday mornings we'd spend in bed reading different books, but sharing interesting passages with each other. I missed his laugh. I missed the way he'd hum while cooking dinner. I missed feeling like I mattered to someone, even if I'd warped that feeling into something toxic. I looked through old photos of Eric and me, really looked at them, paying attention to details I'd missed before. In the early pictures, we both looked genuinely happy. But as I scrolled through years of memories, I watched Eric's smile gradually become more forced, his posture more careful. In our last vacation photos from the beach house rental, Eric looked like he was performing happiness rather than feeling it. His arm was around me, but his shoulders were tense. He was smiling, but his eyes looked tired. I'd been so focused on getting the perfect shot for social media that I'd missed the fact that my husband was miserable. The hardest part about recognizing your own toxicity is that you can't unknow it once you see it clearly. Every memory became tainted with new understanding. The time I'd gotten upset because he'd helped his elderly neighbor with her groceries without telling me first, I convinced myself I was worried about him overcommitting his time. Really, I was angry that he'd made an independent decision to be kind to someone else. The elaborate birthday dinner I'd planned for him, where I'd invited only my friends because his were too immature. I'd told myself I was introducing him to people who would appreciate his qualities. Really, I was ensuring he spent his birthday surrounded by people who would reinforce my narrative about what a lucky man he was. The weekend trip to wine country where I'd planned every activity and gotten frustrated when he suggested alternative ideas I'd justified as good planning. Really, I couldn't tolerate the idea that he might enjoy something I hadn't chosen for him. Now I understood what I'd done to my marriage. I'd loved Eric so much I'd tried to control every variable that might hurt him, including his own choices. I'd been so afraid of losing him that I'd systematically dismantled his autonomy until there was nothing left of the man I'd fallen in love with. The irony was devastating. In trying to protect our relationship, I'd destroyed the very qualities about Eric that had made me love him in the first place: his kindness to others, his independence, his ability to surprise me with his thoughts and perspectives, his joy in simple pleasures I didn't necessarily understand or share. I'd kept him safe by making him smaller, and then wondered why he'd stopped feeling like my equal partner. A year after our divorce, I saw Eric at a coffee shop near my office. He was alone, reading a thick novel and drinking what looked like an elaborate specialty drink. He seemed content, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen during the last years of our marriage. I almost left without saying anything, but something made me walk over to his table. "Hi," I said quietly. He looked up, and his face showed genuine surprise followed by something that might have been warmth. Not romantic warmth, but human kindness. "Juliana, hi, how are you?" "I'm okay, good actually, you look well." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Would you like to sit? I have a few minutes." I sat down, noting that he didn't immediately close his book or put away his phone to give me his complete attention. The old me would have been annoyed by the distraction. The current me found his casual boundaries refreshing. "I owe you an apology," I said before I could lose my nerve. Eric tilted his head slightly, waiting. "I spent our entire marriage trying to turn you into someone I thought I wanted instead of loving who you actually were. I confused control with care, and I made your life smaller because I was afraid of losing you. I'm sorry." He was quiet for a moment, considering my words the way he'd always considered everything. "Thank you for saying that," he said finally. "It means something to hear you recognize it. For what it's worth, I'm working on understanding why I did it. I'm in therapy trying to figure out how to love people without trying to manage them." Eric smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. "That's really good to hear. I hope it's helpful." We talked for maybe 20 minutes about neutral things, work, mutual friends, books we were reading. It was the most relaxed conversation we'd had in years, partly because I no longer had any power over his choices and he no longer had to carefully manage my emotions. As I got up to leave, Eric said something that stayed with me. "You know, I did love being married to you, just not the version of you that was afraid of everything." Walking back to my car, I realized he was right. I had been afraid of everything. Afraid he'd love his family more than me. Afraid his friends would convince him I wasn't good enough. Afraid he'd realize he could do better. Afraid that if I wasn't constantly vigilant, I'd lose the best thing that had ever happened to me. And because I was so afraid of losing him, I'd made sure there was nothing left of our relationship worth keeping. These days, I'm learning to love differently. I'm dating someone new, someone who challenges me and doesn't automatically defer to my preferences. When I catch myself trying to steer his decisions, I pause and ask whether I'm responding from love or from fear. It's harder than the old way. Loving someone without controlling them means accepting that they might make choices you disagree with, have relationships that don't include you, and sometimes prioritize things that aren't you. It means trusting that someone will choose to be with you because they want to, not because you've eliminated all their other options. But it's also more real. When someone stays with you because you've manipulated them into isolation, you never really know if they love you or just fear the alternative. When someone chooses you freely from among many options, that choice means something. I still think about Eric sometimes, especially when I'm tempted to fall back into old patterns. I wonder if he's happy, if he's learned to trust his own judgment again, if he's found someone who loves him without trying to improve him. I hope he has. He deserves that kind of love. We all do. But first, we have to learn how to give it.